you've mentioned, and it's come up a number of times already, the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America that you authored. And we wanted to ask, first of all, it's an amazing document, and there's never been anything like this before, especially at all, but especially before the seizure of power. Why did you feel it was important to write it? And is there anything that you had in mind, any particular problems or questions you had in mind when you were writing it that you would suggest for people who are newly reading it that they also think about as they're reading it, or people returning to it?
Well, you know, I just did it because I didn't have anything else to do. No, I mean, look, you know, there's a need for people to have a clear sense, a concrete sense, as well as a, you know, a lofty vision of what it is we're aiming for. You know, sometimes the critics say, oh, you know, you're always complaining about what you don't like this, you don't like that, you don't like it, but you never can say what you're for. Well, you know, here it is concretized what we're for. I mean, first of all, even before this Constitution was written, we were very clear what we were for in broad strokes and in, you know, in basic terms. But I felt there was a need, you know, coming off of summing up a lot of experience of previous, you know, socialist society in China and the Soviet Union before it, before, you know, the revolutions there were overturned and capitalism was restored in the Soviet Union in the 1950s and in China in the 1970s. In summing up this, I felt there was a need to make another leap in terms of what's, you know, we're talking about socialist state power. What socialist state power and the socialist society that it was, you know, bringing the basis for and reinforcing, what should that society actually look like and as living a way as possible so that people could get a concrete sense, and also so we'd have a guideline. You know, what do you do after you make a revolution? What do you do on day one, people often raise? Well, this was a, you know, look, in the actual event of a successful revolution, there'll be a lot of new questions that'll get thrown up. Some things may turn out to be different than the way they're, you know, in some particulars of that Constitution. But it does lay out the basic principles and a lot of very concrete guidelines and institutional, you know, procedures and institutional you know, organizations that could actually guide people on how to begin the day after seizing power, so to speak, and actually transforming society in a way that would be emancipating. So that was, you know, why I recognized the need for that. And I did have certain questions in mind. I did a lot of study of, you know, I've been wrestling with this question for several years, like, what should be the character? You know, we can learn from China, we can learn from the Soviet Union, but we can also see certain shortcomings. What should be the character of the actual system, of the actual state power, of the actual institutions, from the political, governmental institutions to the culture, to the educational system, and so on? What should be their actual character? What can we learn from past experience? Where can we see that things need to be done differently and better? So that was a sort of a general concern. I did, you know, a lot of reading. I studied, you know, I looked into the constitutions of the Soviet Union, particularly from the 1930s. I went back and looked at the Chinese constitutions during the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and 70s. I went and I read the Magna Carta. I read the, you know, the rights of the French document, the Rights of Man. You know, I read the U.S. Constitution again to, you know, to try to get a sense of the contradictions that they were dealing with, even though that was a different system, as well as the constitutions that were actually socialist constitutions. And there is, as I point out in the book, The New Communism, there is one, you know, essential and basic contradiction that I felt was important to speak to and to lay the basis for dealing with in a somewhat different way than it had been done in the history of socialist societies previously. And that is the contradiction that we can scientifically determine that communism, the achievement of communism and the revolution that's necessary for that, is objectively in the interest of the broad masses of people of the world, the overwhelming majority of humanity. But, and we can learn this from the experience of previous socialist societies, at any given time, not everybody in whose interest that revolution is wanted at any given time. And yet, that's one problem. And yet, at the same time, it would be absolutely criminal to make a revolution and then hand power back to the people you just overthrew and let them subject the masses of people to all the horrors that you just made a revolution to do away with. And besides that sort of obvious thing, there's also the question that, at a given point, what if a significant section of the masses has become, disoriented, has felt that the revolution is not really doing what they wanted to do and so on, and they're sort of open to being persuaded, in some subtle or even overt ways to go back to the old system. And then you have the problem, okay, it took us however many decades to actually overthrow the system. Now we're going to just let people, take us back to the old system, and we have to start all over again. No. So how do you handle this contradiction that this is in the objective interest of the masses of people, but not all of them want it at any given time? Well, you cannot handle this correctly, and it's not going to lead to a good result if you, in effect, put guns in the backs of the masses and try to force march them to communism because, quote unquote, it's in your interests. So what this Constitution is doing is providing the institutionalized means where, yes, if, say, 90% of the people wanted to go back to capitalism, they could, through the institutions of this system and its electoral processes, actually effect that. But it would take an overwhelming majority of people to do that. Meanwhile, the institutional basis provides the means for continuing on the road of socialism without having to put guns at the back of the masses, including those who become disaffected temporarily. It's like a hangover. Masses of people get swayed. We want to go back to capitalism. And then they wake up and they say, man, I got a fucking hangover. I forgot what this fucking capitalism was like. What the fuck was I thinking of? So this is a way of not having that determine things. So that the way the electoral processes are set up, it does serve to reinforce the existing system while allowing the masses to have a lot of sway in determining who their leader, a lot of voice in terms of who their actual leaders are. And it even allows for the possibility that people could vote to go back to capitalism if there were an overwhelming majority. But it provides the institutional means so that people don't suffer from that kind of hangover. So that, but on the other hand, you're not force marching them to communism with guns at their back. So they, some of these anarchists and others say, well, this is all a sham. You, to use the old saying, you giveth with one hand and taketh away with the other. You pretend, you let the people vote, but you stack the voting so it goes the way you want it to. Well, yes. I mean, the point is that there is as long as you have a society divided into different classes, into, oppressive social relations that you're still striving to overcome, there's no such thing as pure democracy. They always talk about free and fair elections. They called the election in Iraq when they were occupying the country with their own military a free and fair election. But even when don't have guns at your back, or the police aren't coming your door and dragging you out and telling you how to vote, you're being influenced by all the institutions of society and by the underlying operation of the economic system and the prevailing social relations. You're being influenced that the only reasonable thing to do is to vote to reinforce the system. That's what happens under capitalism when people go vote. It even gets to ridiculous dimensions. I saw, Bill Maher, I saw him on TV, I was going to say that asshole, but, he has one or two points, but he's mainly just really, having a bad influence. And he's trying to convince people that Mike Pence is not so bad because the alternative is Donald Trump. And he goes into this whole thing about when you take an SAT test, at least when I took it, they used to ask you a question. They said, choose the best option out of this set of questions. And then he used that to say, you see, the way these reformists always talk, we can't make the perfect the enemy of the good. Therefore, we have to choose the least bad alternative. Well, Pence may be this and that. He's a Christian fundamentalist, blah, blah, but he's not trying to pull off a coup. And, he's trying to use the mechanisms of the system to institute a fascist theocracy, okay? And I say, Bill Maher, talk about a poverty of imagination and the lowered sights and limits of what you see as possible, that you're posing to people the choice between Donald Trump and Mike Pence. But the fact is, there's a certain logic to what Bill Maher is saying there. You got to work within the reality of the system as it is. You got to make the choices. Yeah, okay, you could vote for some radical, but it's not going to get any votes. It's not going to mean anything. You're just going to take votes away from the good Democrat, or maybe from Mike Pence. But this is what happens under this system. There's no such thing as a free and fair election in the sense of being free of the influence of the dominant relations and institutions in the society. And yes, in this Constitution, that's also true. But at the same time, in order to avoid this whole thing of force marching to people to communism with guns at their back, it is institutionalizing the means for a tremendous amount of dissent, like I said, cultural, intellectual ferment, so the masses can thrash out a lot of questions without losing the whole thing and then waking up the day after and say, what the fuck were we doing? Mm-hmm. Because, think of everything, all the reasons why people tell us this revolution will never happen. Are they pointing at nothing real? Of course not. They're pointing at very real things. The power of this system in terms of its armed force and its power in terms of molding people's thinking. It's very, very difficult to actually make a revolution. That's why people say to us, it'll never happen. It's too much going against it. It's too powerful. Too many people are fucked up. People are not thinking that way. The middle class is too big, and so on and so forth. Well, all that's real, and all that has to be overcome. And imagine you overcome all that, and then you encounter problems with building a new economy. You encounter problems in working out the non-oppressive relations among different sections of the people, and people become disaffected, and they forgot what it was like being under capitalism, and they want to temporarily go back, and then a week later they say, could you revolutionaries please come around again and start organizing us to get back to the other system we had, which we forgot was much better? So this is why it's institutionalized, that there are processes for people to actually choose their leaders to a very significant extent, but within a definite framework. And there are institutionalized means and provisions and encouragement of and for dissent and cultural and intellectual ferment, but within a certain framework, just as democracy is practiced within a certain framework, a very different framework within this society and this system. I would say the central problem, historical problem of the communist revolution that it's speaking to and providing the institutional means to deal with is this contradiction that this revolution and advance to communism in the world is in the fundamental interest of the masses of people, but not all the people want it all the time. But you can't solve that by force marching people to, on that road with guns at their back. So this is the institutional means for resolving that contradiction in a way that doesn't require you or force you to do that, but actually corresponds to what are the fundamental interests of the masses of people, which is why they would have risen up under your leadership to make a revolution in the first place.